Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest today is Anne Schiavone, Assistant Professor of Law at Duquesne University School of Law, and we will discuss her article, K-9 Catch-22, The Impossible Dilemma of Using Police Dogs in Apprehension of Suspects, which will appear in the University of Pittsburgh Law Review. So welcome to the podcast, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Your paper was really interesting and also frankly, kind of like sad and troubling as well. And I felt like in a lot of ways it was sort of bookended by two stories that you told about two particular police dogs in Pittsburgh and what happened to them. And so, I was wondering if you could start by just telling that story for listeners who may not have heard of it before.
Sure. So in 2014, the Pittsburgh police had an incident with a suspect who was wanted on a number of charges, sex offender charges and some others. And he holed up in the basement of a house in the Lawrenceville neighborhood of the city. And the K-9 unit was called in to deal with him. And he was hiding in the basement, and the K-9 unit brought their dog and announced that the dog was going to be released. And this was the K-9 involved in this incident was named Rocco. And Rocco entered the property and went into the basement to locate the suspect, John Rush, and he encountered the suspect, and the suspect had a knife and stabbed the dog, also broke the dog's shoulder. And he was eventually apprehended by the police after attacking some of the officers as well. And the dog was rushed to a local emergency veterinarian, and after several surgeries in 2 days, he succumbed to his injuries. So that made a big impression in the city, and there was a large mourning over the life of the dog, and the dog was given full honors in his funeral, and there was a large procession of police officers and canines from around the country that came to the funeral. The suspect, who had been apprehended alive, was tried, and he was sentenced on all of the charges that he had been, wanted prior to the incident, and then also on the attacking the officers and the killing of the K-9. And he was given up to 44 years in prison, which was a significant amount of jail time. But this incident kind of, everybody was very upset about the dog, and there was a lot of grief over the life of the dog. And the state legislature of Pennsylvania passed a statute called Rocco's Law, which raised the crime of killing a police dog from a third-degree felony to a second-degree felony, and gave it up to 10 years. It was possible to get up to 10 years in prison for that action.
Right. So sort of like a police dog equivalent of the increased penalties for hurting police officers.
Exactly. And while that couldn't be used against John Rush because, his incident was prior to the passage of that law, the sentencing judge did take into account the actions against the dog when she sentenced him.
Okay. And then you told a second story, which was also very troubling, but in a slightly different way.
Yes. So 2 years almost to the day, Pittsburgh had another police dog incident. This one occurred with Port Authority Police. So it was a different set. It was a different authority, right? The city of Pittsburgh was involved in the first incident, and then this was the Port Authority Police. And two African-American men were drinking on Port Authority property, drinking alcohol. And the police had been called, and the Port Authority police tried to get them to kind of disperse, and they were a little belligerent and not really following direction. And the K-9 unit was again called in. And the two African-American men were father and son, and Bruce Kelly Sr. and Bruce Kelly Jr. And Bruce Kelly Jr. they were having more trouble getting him to cooperate with the police. And they told him they were going to release the police dog, gave him the verbal warning as is required. And Bruce Kelly Jr. said, if you release the dog, and he used some expletives in his statement, I'm going to kill it. And he point blank told the police he would kill the dog. Prior, of course, just to back up slightly, prior to bringing in the K-9 unit, the police did try to use tasers and some other tactics against him, but the taser didn't work. He had a heavy coat on. So again, they felt like the dog was the next step. And even upon hearing this, statement by Bruce Kelly Jr. that he was going to kill the dog was released, and he stabbed it through the snout and killed it. Unfortunately, once the dog was stabbed, the police opened fire on Bruce Kelly Jr.
Right.
Shot him 12 times, and he died instantly.
So a very, well, in some ways similar, but in some ways very different outcome. And it sounds like a different context as well.
Yes. And, part of the aftermath of the incident was that the dog was given, full law enforcement honors, and the community was much more conflicted here. Certainly everybody mourned the loss of the dog, but the life of the person was lost in some instances. And there were members of the community that were very concerned with the fact that the life of the dog seemed to be taking precedence over the life of the individual that was killed.
Yeah. So it seems like we've got these difficult questions about sort of what kind of values are implicated in these circumstances, but also, as you talk about in your paper, questions around when it's appropriate, if ever, and when it isn't appropriate to use dogs for this purpose.
Yeah. So, the idea for this paper kind of came about when I talked to my husband. He and I talked after the Rocco incident, which was the first incident. And he said, if I were this guy, I would have defended myself too. And I was a little surprised by that. I kind of had the general reaction of all the other, community members, that how terrible it was that this dog was killed. And he said, he actually did some Schutzen training, which is the obedience and defense protection work with dogs. He had worked with Rottweilers and with German Shepherds. And he had put on the suit, right, the bite suit, and taken bites from German Shepherds and from Rottweilers. And he said, if I faced that, I would absolutely try to defend myself.
Right.
So that kind of got me thinking. And then when the second incident happened with Bruce Kelly Jr. and the K-9 Aaron, I thought, oh, this is an exact example of what he was talking about. And, I started thinking about, well, how are people reacting to dogs? Is it normal for people to want to defend themselves or not? So, I kind of looked into the science behind it, and that the idea of, fight or flight, and whether, people how they were reacting, and whether this was a rational response in the face of the police dog.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if we could start this conversation by sort of giving a little bit more context for sort of how police departments use K-9 units, and the different things that they do, and how common is it for police departments to be using dogs in police work?
So it's extremely common. There are no good estimates on the number of police dogs being used in the country at the moment, but in 2010, there was an estimate of about, it's wild guess estimate of about 50,000 in the country. Policing with dogs really didn't start until the 20th century. And even the first half of the 20th century, it wasn't all that common. There were maybe only 13 different police departments that used police dogs at that time. But then in the late 50s, those numbers started going up, and into the hundreds and thousands by the end of the 20th century in terms of the number of different units, police dog units. Most police forces have a K-9 unit at this point. Certainly all the major cities do. And they're used for a variety of things, tracking and search and rescue. And of course, we all know about the drug sniffing dogs as well, bomb sniffing dogs. And then of course, one function is apprehension of suspects. Okay.
So the apprehending suspects is only one thing among many different things then that K-9 units are used by police officers to do. How do they do that? Like, what kind of techniques do police officers use, or how are these dogs trained in the context of apprehending suspects?
So there are basically two general training methods. There's what's called bite and hold, which is probably the most common type of training. And that occurs when a dog is released. It's trained to seize the suspect by biting them. If they do not resist, the dog just holds on to them. If they do, and if they break the hold, the dog is trained to, of course, re-establish the bite. So this can become a little bit violent. If a person is resisting arrest, they can receive multiple bites from the dog and can have serious wounds. Now, if they just stay still, there's just a single bite, theoretically. The second training method is what's called bark and hold. And that occurs when a dog is trained to simply find the suspect and bark and keep them in place. If the suspect attempts to flee or attempts to fight, that is when the dog is trained to bite at that point. So it's theoretically maybe a little less violent, at least to start, although it does give more agency to the dog, which some people think is maybe problematic as well, because the dog has to make the decision whether the person is trying to fight or flee.
One thing I was wondering when I was reading your paper was, are there like variations on those techniques? And to the extent is like one or the other like more difficult to train the dog to do?
Bark and hold tends to be more difficult because it is granting agency to that dog. It's just a little bit more problematic in terms of making sure the dog is reacting properly under the circumstances. Bite and hold is more common and tends to be a little bit easier. It it leaves more of the agency in the hands of the officer that's handling the dog.
Okay, well, so then, to the extent that the officer is making the initial decision whether or not essentially to use the dog for the purpose of suspect apprehension, sort of what standard are officers expected to use in making that decision, and how is their decision evaluated?
So under the law, dogs are not considered deadly force. So they're in the category of tasers and, other non-deadly tools used by the police. So under the law, generally speaking, courts are looking to a standard that was first articulated in Graham v. Connor, which allows it's often considered a subjective objective standard. So the police have the ability to, depending on the circumstances, the totality of the circumstances, in the officer's purview at the moment, they could determine whether that source of force is appropriate at the time. So it's looking through the eyes of the officer at the moment. And that is for most non-deadly weapons at the hand or in the possession of the officers.
Okay. So why are police dogs considered, or the use of a police dog considered, a form of non-deadly force? I mean, it sounds like, at least in some contexts, suspects do die as a result of a dog attack.
Yes, there are at least 4 known deaths at the hands of police dogs. There's probably more. We don't have a whole lot of statistics on that, and quite frankly, police departments don't like to publicize when dogs are involved in the death of a suspect. There is known significant injury from police dogs, and ultimately, other than firearms, no other type of tool used by officers has been deemed deadly weapons at this point by the courts. The model penal code suggests that anything that might pose a serious threat of physical harm would or death could qualify as deadly force. But at this point, the courts just have been unwilling to call police dogs deadly force. It's very rare. The deaths are very rare, but the injuries are not. So, it's hard to say, but I think it's just this sense of wanting to, give, officers and law enforcement as much leeway as they can have.
Right. So I'm not really a criminal law person, but it seems like there's a weird lack of reciprocity there, in the sense that, a criminal suspect, it seems like, a butter knife is like potentially deadly force, right?
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it. It's the fact that, the courts at this point, especially Supreme Court, they really want to give the officers the opportunity to use the tools at their disposal. And in some ways, you can look at this as, if you have the option of using a dog versus a gun, well, the suspect does have a better chance of surviving the dog bite. So, in that way, maybe you do want the dog over the gun.
Right. So maybe there's an incentive thing, like we do, like to the extent that there are kinds of force that police officers can choose that might be less deadly than others, we should encourage them to consider using less deadly rather than more deadly force.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way you describe the standard for evaluating the police officer's decision sounds like it's largely kind of a holistic standard, like kind of look at all the circumstances. But, in your research, have you noticed particular factors that courts tended to think were important or to consider, or are there factors you think they should be considering?
So some of the factors that the courts have decided kind of lend themselves to excessive force and in police dog bite cases. And most of these cases are brought under Section 1983, 42 USC 1983. So they're excessive force cases under that statute. And for the most part, usually courts are giving deference to the police in these police dog bite cases. There are certain times when the courts seem to be more willing to entertain the plaintiff's point of view. And that is particularly where injuries are very severe, where the police lose command of the dog, or bites take a longer amount of time than is necessary to actually subdue the suspect, where no warning is given. Usually a warning is required before a police dog is released under most tactics, most police tactics, where those warnings are not given. Those cases have sometimes resulted in verdicts for the plaintiff. And, just generally where a crime is particularly minor, so shoplifting, for instance, where a dog was used in that circumstance, again, not always, but courts are more willing to entertain the plaintiff's claims.
Right, right. So how do courts tend to react when the suspects do fight back against a dog attack? And sort of, you talk about the likely reaction or the potential reactions of a suspect. How should that affect the way courts evaluate that situation?
So the problem, and this is really, in my view, the problem with this subjective objective approach, is that it's completely in the eyes of the officer at the time. And the officer doesn't really need to take into account the circumstance surrounding that suspect. So, for instance, with Bruce Kelly Jr., the police were called because he and his father were drinking alcohol on the property of the Port Authority. And, there was really no sense of the fact that releasing the dog on someone who is inebriated might result in a different reaction than someone who's has all their faculties. Same thing with mental health issues. John Rush, it was known to the police and known to have significant mental health issues. Bruce Kelly Jr. also had mental health issues. So when dogs are released on these kinds of suspects, the officer does not need, under the law, to take into account any of that. And to me, that seems short-sighted and somewhat unfair to the suspects. Where information about that suspect is known, that should be incorporated in the totality of the circumstances. Certainly the fact that Bruce Kelly Jr. was drinking alcohol should have been considered in whether it was appropriate to release the dog under that circumstance. But, under the law at this point, it's not necessary.
Right. So if I'm understanding correctly, then you're suggesting that in evaluating the officer's decision, and I guess maybe also in training officers about when it is and isn't appropriate to use dogs, that they should be thinking holistically, not just from their own perspective, but also from the broader social perspective and from the perspective of the suspect?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm, there are other scholars that have written, more substantially about this in terms of deadly force, but viewing the use of force against a suspect, we should be thinking more about how to de-escalate situations than to escalate them, and tools like dogs can be very useful, but the officers need to understand that using a dog is probably going to escalate the violence. And is there a way, rather than escalating, is there a way to de-escalate? That should be, in my view, the first approach. Right.
Well, it does seem that, since unlike mechanical tools, dogs do have agency and act of their own volition, even when they're well trained. Should that independent agency of the dog affect the training and analysis of when it's appropriate or not to use a dog in this context?
Certainly, in some ways. So, one of the things that the courts have wrestled with is, when the dog has gone beyond its training, right, and continued to bite a suspect beyond what is necessary. In some cases, the courts have said, okay, the plaintiff has a right in this circumstance. And in some cases, the courts have said, no, the dog was trained properly. And just because the handler, lost control for a period of time, we're not going to kind of entertain the case. So, the fact that the dogs are not, that they do have a mind of their own, is something that the officers and certainly, K-9 officers understand, and they're attached to their dogs and they live with their dogs. And so they know what their dogs are like. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that they all have a mind of their own, and the officer's not always going to be in complete control.
Yeah. So in your paper, you also suggest the potential for a disparate impact on African American subjects based on sort of history and current social context. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and why you think that's a particular problem.
So I trace back a little bit of the use of dogs against African Americans in particular in U.S. history, and of course started with the use of dogs against runaway slaves, and then through the Civil Rights era. And we, of course, have that iconic picture in Life magazine of the police dogs attacking protesters. And then again into the 1990s, Los Angeles Police Department was criticized heavily for the disparate impact of dog bites against minorities, African American and Latino populations. So all of that, kind of comes historically to us. And, the question, I don't try to answer the question of whether there is actual bias in policing and the use of dogs, although there have been studies that suggest there is some bias. There's also studies that suggest there isn't. However, I take it from the perspective of the fact that there's this kind of known use of dogs against minorities, particularly African Americans, impacts the reaction of African Americans to dogs and to police dogs in particular. There's some scientific research that suggests that this historic use of dogs against African Americans has actually caused greater phobia of dogs in certain in the African American community, and that can impact the reaction of a suspect who is of African American descent, who faces a police dog in being faced with the use of a police dog against them. So, it just seems like that is something that potentially also needs to be considered amongst the totality of the circumstances.
Right. Okay. Well, in closing, Anne, I was wondering if you could kind of, in a nutshell, let listeners know how you think your research informs or potentially informs the decisions that police forces make about how to train officers in when it's appropriate or inappropriate to use dogs in suspect apprehension, and how courts should go about evaluating the legitimacy or the appropriateness of those training standards.
Well, I'm hoping, I would like to see that this paper kind of open people's eyes a little bit to the need to collect a little more data on police dogs and how police dogs are used. I would like, law enforcement to understand that, using the dog is going to escalate violence, and that maybe in certain circumstances we have to consider who that dog is being used against and in what circumstance, and perhaps realizing that, the dog isn't necessary and shouldn't be, that first, type of tool to use, right? That maybe there's a way to de-escalate the circumstance rather than going to the dog too quickly. And I think that's really the point. I recognize that, police dogs are useful and are helpful in a lot of circumstances. I would say even the situation involving John Rush, where he was holed up in a basement. I mean, that is a textbook example of when a dog is going to protect the life of an officer by going in first. But at the same time, there are other circumstances that, the dog shouldn't be even the second or third option, because of the situation involving the suspect. And I think taking into account the circumstances of the suspect should be, more on the forefront of law enforcement at that point. That's where I'm going with this, I guess.
Great. Well, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you about your paper, Ann.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Training a dog is in the minds of most people a difficult and trying proposition. Actually, it is quite simple. Deal with your dog as though you were dealing with a child. You must be gentle with a sensitive dog and proportionately firmer with a rough and tough dog. The primary education of a dog consists of his learning the meaning of 5 words. They are heel, sit, stay, down, and come. I repeat, heel, sit, stay, down, and come. These are easily taught if you use each word in association with a directive action, such as a gentle jerk on the leash to attract the dog's attention. For equipment, you need a slip collar, preferably a chain collar, and a 6-foot leash. Let's first teach the dog to heel. To your dog, the single word heel must always mean walk by my left side. Place the dog on your left side. Double the end of your leash and hold it in your right hand about waist high, and with your left hand, grasp the leash approximately 14 inches lower. Adjust the leash so that it hangs below the dog's neck, forming the letter U between your leg and the dog's. From this point on, you must never keep a tight leash on the dog, because a tight leash means choking, and when the dog is choking, he cannot possibly be thinking of what you are trying to teach him. Okay, we're set to move. When you start to walk, always step out with your left foot. This will soon become his guide for walking. First, call the dog's name to get his attention. Step out, say heel, and give a gentle jerk forward on the leash, all at the same time. I use the word jerk even though it seems like a harsh treatment, because I want to avoid dragging the dog. The second the dog moves with you, put the slack back in the leash, walk back and forth, stop occasionally, and repeat the same action. While walking, you will continue to give the heel commands and gentle jerks whenever the dog is not in position. The proper heel is accomplished when the dog's right leg is in line with your left leg, but not in direct contact with it. In a short time, the jerks will not be necessary. The word heel alone will suffice. Practice this exercise only for 2 or 3 days, devoting 10 to 15 minutes each day in a drill. When your dog has a general idea of the meaning of the word heel, you can teach him to sit. With the dog at the heel position, grasp the leash with your right hand about 6 inches from the collar. Place your left hand on the dog's hindquarters, then pull up with your right hand, press down with your left hand, and say, sit. Practice the heel and sit for a week for 10 to 15 minutes each day. He then is ready to be taught the stay command.